At Sunday dinner, my son slid a folder of papers across the table, right past the mashed potatoes, and he said, "Dad, we've been talking, and we think it's time you signed the house over to us. You can live in the basement, rent-free. We'll take care of everything." And his wife, Whitney, sitting next to him in my dining room, at the table my wife bought 40 years ago, looked at me and added, "Honestly, Walter, it's more than you deserve. More than I deserve. In my own house, at my own table." And I picked up the pen my son had helpfully set on top of the folder, and I opened it to the line with the little flag sticker next to it, and I signed my name, without a word. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't ask a single question. I just signed, and I capped the pen, and I slid the folder back across the table, and I said, "Anyone want more potatoes?" I need to stop right here, 10 seconds in, because I know exactly what you're thinking. You're thinking, here's a beaten old man, too weak to stand up for himself, letting his own son and that woman walk all over him and take the roof over his head. And I want you to hold on to that thought because it's exactly what my son thought, and it's exactly what Whitney thought, and it is exactly what I wanted them both to think. Because I wasn't beaten. I want to be very clear about that. I signed those papers with a steady hand and a quiet heart, because I knew something that my son did not know. I'd known it for 6 years, and in 3 weeks at a closing, in front of a title officer and a room full of people, everybody else was going to find it out too. And when that title officer read one single line off her screen, and then quietly asked everyone in the room to stop talking, the look on my son's face was going to answer something I'd been quietly wondering for a long time. So, if you've ever been underestimated by the very people who should know you best, if you've ever been treated as a fool by someone you'd have given anything for, then stay with me, and go ahead and subscribe, because this is a story about what it means to be quietly, patiently, 10 steps ahead. Okay, let me back up, because you can't understand that dinner, or that pen, or that closing, without understanding a promise I made to my wife 6 years ago. My name is Walter Dunn. I'm 63 years old, and I spent 40 years as a machinist, a toolmaker, the kind of work where you're accurate to 1,000th of an inch or you're not working, where a small mistake ruins an expensive part and a careless one takes off a finger. 40 years of that teaches you a particular way of thinking. It teaches you patience. It teaches you to measure twice and cut once, to think a job all the way through before you ever pick up a tool, to see the whole thing finished in your mind before you start. I built things for a living, careful things, things that had to last and had to hold. And it turns out that's a useful way to think about a family too, though I learned that part later and harder. I bought my house 38 years ago, a modest place on a quiet street, and I raised my son Derek in it, and I grew old in it with my wife, Eleanor. Eleanor was the heart of that house. She picked the table we ate that Sunday dinner at. She planted the garden. She painted Derek's height on the doorframe in the kitchen year after year, and those pencil marks are still there, and I'll get to them, because they matter more than you'd think. Eleanor died 6 years ago. Cancer, slow and cruel, 18 months of it. And when you lose the person you built your whole life with, a lot of things come into focus that were blurry before. And one of the things that came into focus for me, in the quiet after she was gone, was my son. I loved Derek. I need to say that because everything I'm about to tell you is true, and it doesn't cancel out the love, it just sits next to it, which is the hardest thing about family. But I'd be lying if I told you I didn't see, even before Eleanor passed, that my son had become someone I didn't fully recognize. Derek had always been a little too focused on what other people had. As a boy, it was toys, then it was cars, then it was the size of a house and the label on a watch. He married Whitney about 12 years ago, and Whitney was cut from the same cloth, maybe a finer version of it, and together the two of them wanted a life that was always just a little bigger than the one they could afford. They were always reaching, always leveraged, always one big move away from the life they thought they deserved. And I watched my son's warmth get a little thinner every year, crowded out by wanting. But here is the thing that mattered most to me, the thing that made me do what I did. Derek and Whitney had 2 children, my grandchildren. Ella, who is 10 now, and Ben, who is 8. And those 2 kids are the light of my life. Ella is named after Eleanor. It was the last thing that made my wife cry with happiness before she got sick, hearing that our first grandchild would carry her name. And I look at those two kids the way you can only look at grandchildren, which is with a love that has nothing left to prove and nothing it wants back. They come over on Saturdays. Ben helps me in the garage. I've been teaching him to use the old lathe, and there's a look he gets when he makes something come out right, this quiet pride, that is so much like my father and so much like me that it stops my heart a little. Ella reads to me. She's decided she's going to be a veterinarian, and she reads me articles about animals I have no interest in, and I listen to every word because I'd listen to that child read a phone book. Last year, Ella asked me, out of nowhere, if the house would always be there, if she could bring her own kids someday to the house with the marks on the kitchen door. And I told her yes. I told her this house would be in our family for a very long time, that I'd made sure of it, and she nodded like that was just an ordinary true thing, the way kids do when you tell them something solid, and she went back to her article about otters. She has no idea she was standing in the middle of the whole reason for everything. They are, quite simply, the best thing left in my life. And 6 years ago, sitting by Eleanor's bed near the end, I made her a promise. She was worried, at the end, about the same thing I was worried about because she knew our son too. She took my hand and she said, "Walter, promise me the house goes to the kids, to Ella and Ben. Promise me you'll make sure of it. Not to Derek and to the kids. Make sure nobody can take it from them." And I promised her. I promised my dying wife that the home we'd built, the home with our grandchildren's height marks on the kitchen door frame, would go to those grandchildren, and that I would make certain in a way that couldn't be undone, that nobody could ever take it away from them. I've thought a lot about why Eleanor spent some of her last clear days worrying about a house. You'd think, at the end, a person would think only about the big things: love, God, the people in the room. But Eleanor was practical the way I was practical. She'd run our home for 40 years, paid the bills, kept the accounts, and she knew that love without a plan is just a feeling that good intentions can't protect. She'd watched her own sister's family tear itself apart over a house when their mother passed. No will, everyone grabbing, cousins who don't speak to this day. And she'd watched our son become a man who reached for things. So near the end, when the pain would ease for an hour and her mind would come back clear, she didn't want to talk about the past. She wanted to make sure the future was nailed down. "I can go," she told me one night, "but I need to know the kids are taken care of and nobody can wreck it. Promise me you'll make it so solid it can't come apart." That was my Eleanor, thinking about her grandchildren's future from the edge of her own. And a machinist knows that a promise is just a wish unless you build the thing that makes it hold. So I built it. A few months after Eleanor died, I went to see an estate attorney, a careful, patient woman who reminded me a little of the work I'd done my whole life, precise, thorough, no wasted motion. And I told her what I wanted, and she told me how to build it so it would hold, and together we did. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm going to explain this the way she explained it to me, in plain terms because your audience deserves to understand it, and because it's the whole hinge of this story. What we did was put my house into an irrevocable trust, and the important parts, the parts that matter, are these. Once that house went into the trust, I no longer personally owned it. The trust owned it. I don't mean that as a technicality, I mean it as the plain fact that would matter enormously 3 weeks later in a title company conference room. Walter Dunn, the man, did not own that house anymore. The trust did, and the trust had terms. Terms I set, terms that could not be changed once it was done. That's what irrevocable means. It means you can't take it back, which was exactly the point, because Eleanor had asked me to make it so nobody could undo it, including a future version of me who might get talked into something by his own son. Under those terms, I had what's called a life estate. In plain English, that means I have the absolute right to live in that house for the rest of my life. Nobody can put me out. Nobody can sell it out from under me. It is my home until the day I die, guaranteed, in writing, permanently. And then, when I'm gone, the house does not go to my son. Under the terms of that trust, the house passes to the beneficiaries I named. And the beneficiaries I named 6 years ago, keeping a promise to my dying wife, were my grandchildren, Ella and Ben. I remember signing those trust documents in that lawyer's quiet office about 4 months after I buried my wife. It was a strange thing to feel, sitting there with a pen, the near opposite of what I'd feel 3 weeks later watching Derek sign his worthless deed. Because Derek would sign his papers grasping for something. I signed mine, letting something go. I was giving up ownership of my own home, on purpose, permanently, handing it to a structure that would outlive me and protect 2 children from whatever the future held. The lawyer asked me, gently, if I was sure. People usually keep more control, she said. Most folks don't want to give up the ability to change their minds. And I told her that was exactly the point. That I wanted to build something my own future weakness couldn't dismantle. That I'd rather tie my own hands than leave a door somebody could talk me through when I was old and lonely and missing my wife. She looked at me for a moment, and then she nodded, and she said, "That's the most clear-eyed reason I've heard in a long time, and we did it. The house belongs to a trust. I get to live in it for life. And then it goes to my grandchildren, and there's nothing anybody can do to change that. That's what I built. That's the machine I made to hold my promise. And I never told Derek that's the part you need to understand. I didn't tell my son about the trust, and I want to be honest about why, because it's not a flattering reason. Part of it was that Eleanor and I had always kept our finances private, the way our generation does. But the bigger part, the truer part, is that some quiet, careful instinct in me, the same instinct that measures twice, told me not to. Told me that this was a thing better kept than shared. I didn't know, 6 years ago, that my son would one day slide papers across my dinner table. But some part of me knew enough to keep the one card that mattered face down. I didn't build that trust as a trap. I built it as a promise to Eleanor. But a promise, kept quietly, can become a trap for someone who reaches for something that was never theirs. And that's exactly what happened. So now, let me take you back to that Sunday, and this time you'll see it the way I saw it, which is a very different scene than the one Derek thought he was in. They'd been building up to it for weeks, I realize now. Whitney, especially. There'd been comments about how big the house was for one person, about how I was rattling around in here alone, about how they were so cramped in their place with the kids, about how it would just make sense for the family if things were arranged differently. I heard all of it. I'm old, not deaf, and I'm a lot more observant than my son ever gave me credit for. I knew something was coming. I just didn't know they'd have the nerve to do it at Sunday dinner, in front of a folder with flag stickers on it, like a business transaction. Because that's what got me sitting there. Not that they wanted the house. I'd made my peace long ago with the fact that Derek and Whitney wanted things. It was the contempt. It was the folder, prepared in advance. It was the little sticker showing me where to sign, because they were so certain I'd sign. So certain I was a foregone conclusion, a formality, an old man who'd do what he was told. It was Whitney saying, "It's more than you deserve," in the house where I'd raised the man she married, at the table where his mother used to sit. They didn't come to ask me for something. They came to inform me of a decision and to watch me comply. And I'll tell you the exact moment I decided to sign without a word. It was when I looked at Derek's face, and I saw that he wasn't even uncomfortable. I'd thought, right up until that moment, that maybe this was all Whitney, that maybe my boy was being led, that I'd see some shame in him, some flicker of the boy I'd raised in that house. And there wasn't any. He was calm, he was expectant. He had done the math and decided his father was a resource to be reallocated, and he felt fine about it. And in that moment, a question I'd been carrying for 6 years, ever since Eleanor made me promise, got very sharp and very clear. Who is my son, really? Not who do I hope he is. Who is he actually when he thinks no one who matters is watching? And I realized I had a way to find out for certain. All I had to do was sign, because I knew what they didn't. I knew that the papers in that folder were worthless. I knew that my signature on Derek's quitclaim deed conveyed nothing, because you cannot give away what you do not own, and I did not own that house, the trust did. Derek had drawn up papers to transfer a house from a man who didn't have it to give. He'd measured wrong. He'd measured wrong 6 years ago and never knew it, and now he was cutting, confidently, into the wrong piece of stock. So I signed. I let my son and his wife believe they'd won. I let them have their moment of quiet triumph over the potatoes, because I understood something that Whitney, with all her sharpness, did not. That the cheapest way to learn exactly who a person is to let them think they've already gotten away with it. People show you their whole soul in the 10 minutes after they believe they've won. And Derek and Whitney showed me theirs. They were pleasant after I signed, relaxed. Whitney even helped clear the plates, chatty now, generous in victory, already talking about how they'd fix the place up. Derek clapped me on the shoulder on the way out, the way you'd thank a man for a reasonable business decision, and said, "This is the right thing, Dad, you'll see." And I said, "I'm sure I will." And I meant it in a way he did not catch. Before they even left that Sunday, Whitney did something small that I've never forgotten. On her way out, she stopped in my living room, looked around at Eleanor's things, the pictures, the furniture, the life we'd built, and she said brightly, "We'll probably get rid of most of this old stuff when we redo it. Freshen it up." My wife's things. Old stuff. She said it the way you'd talk about clearing out a storage unit in front of me in the house I was apparently going to be living in the basement of. And I just smiled and nodded and filed it away with everything else, one more piece of measurement confirming exactly what I was dealing with. They took the folder, and over the next 3 weeks they moved fast, which told me everything about why they'd really done it, because people don't rush like that on a house they mean to live in and lovingly restore. People move fast on a house they intend to squeeze. And here's what I learned later about what was actually going on with Derek and Whitney, the thing under the thing. They were in trouble. Money trouble, the deep kind, the kind that comes from years of reaching for a life you can't afford. They were leveraged to the hilt, behind on things, and they had found what they thought was the answer. My house, which they assumed I owned free and clear after 38 years, sitting there full of equity like a piggy bank they'd finally figured out how to break. The plan was never really to move me to the basement and play happy family. The plan was to get the house in their name and immediately refinance it, take out a big loan against all that equity, pull the cash out, and solve their problems with my life savings poured into brick and mortar over 4 decades. The basement, rent-free, was the story they told to make it sound like generosity instead of what it was. And to do a cash-out refinance, you need a closing. And a closing means a title company. And a title company means a title search. And a title search means that a careful professional sits down and pulls the entire history and legal status of a property before any money moves, because their entire job is to make sure the person selling or borrowing against a house actually has the right to do it. I knew all of this. Derek did not. Or he knew it vaguely, the way people know things they don't think apply to them, and he assumed the search would just confirm that his father owned the house and had signed it over. A formality, a rubber stamp. He had no idea that the search was going to pull up a 6-year-old trust with his own children's names in it. I could have told him, "I want to sit in that with you for a second, because it's the part I've thought about most." In those 3 weeks I could have picked up the phone and said, "Derek, son, stop. Don't waste your money on a closing. The house is in a trust. You can't do this." I could have spared him the embarrassment, and I decided not to. And I've made my peace with that decision, and here's why. Because Derek didn't deserve to be spared the moment. Not out of revenge. I want to be clear, I didn't do it to hurt him. I did it because my son needed to be shown, in a way he could not argue with, wave off, or spin, exactly what he had done and exactly who he had become. If I'd told him quietly over the phone, he'd have gotten angry, made excuses, blamed Whitney, blamed me, and learned nothing. He needed to sit in a title company conference room and hear it read out loud, in front of his wife and a lender and a stranger, that he had just tried to sell his own children's inheritance out from under them. Some lessons only land when they're delivered by someone other than the father you've stopped respecting. So I let it come. And 3 weeks after that Sunday dinner, I got a call from Derek, and he was using his warm voice, the one he used when he needed something. And he said, "Dad, we're doing the paperwork to make everything official on Thursday, just some formalities at the title company, and they said it'd be smoother if you came and signed a couple things in person. Can you make it? 2 o'clock. And I said, "I'll be there, son, 2 o'clock. And I hung up, and I sat in Eleanor's kitchen, and I looked at those height marks on the doorframe, Ella's and Ben's little pencil lines climbing up the wood next to Derek's from 30 years before. And I said quietly, to a woman who wasn't there anymore, "It's going to hold, Elle, just like I promised. It's going to hold." The title company was in a little office park across town, and I got there at 2 in my good shirt, and I want to describe the room because I'd waited 3 weeks for this room. There was a long table. Derek and Whitney were already there, dressed up, looking pleased with themselves, and there was a man from the lender with a laptop, and there was the title officer, a woman about my daughter-in-law's age with reading glasses and a stack of documents in the calm, careful manner of a person who does exact work for a living. I liked her immediately. She reminded me of me. Derek gave me the warm smile. "Dad, glad you could make it. This'll be quick." Whitney gave me a little nod, gracious, the Queen acknowledging the help. And we all sat down, and the title officer started going through her process, the way they do, methodical, reading through documents, confirming identities, and I sat quietly with my hands folded and I waited, because I knew we were getting close to the part where she'd get to the title search itself, the ownership, the status of the property. And I watched her come to it. I watched her pull up a particular document on her screen, and I watched her eyes move across it, and I watched her slow down. She read it again. She had the exact look on her face that I'd had 6 years ago, when my attorney first explained to me what we'd built, the look of a professional recognizing something significant. And she took off her reading glasses, and she looked up, and she looked around the table, and she said, in a very careful voice, "I'm going to need everyone to stop for a moment, please, before we go any further." And the room went quiet. Derek's smile faltered. "Is there a problem?" And the title officer looked back at her screen, and she read one line off of it, out loud, slowly, so there could be no misunderstanding. She said, "The property is held in the Eleanor Dunn Family Trust. The grantor retains a life estate. The remainder beneficiaries are listed as Ella Dunn and Benjamin Dunn." And then she looked up, and she said the quiet part, the part that ended it. "Mr. Dunn does not personally own this property. It's held in trust. He can't convey it, and he can't refinance it. And these papers," she touched the folder Derek had brought, "transfer nothing, because there was nothing to transfer. I'm sorry. We can't proceed. This closing is over." The man from the lender closed his laptop. That was the sound that made it real, somehow. The soft click of that laptop shutting, a man who deals in millions of dollars quietly folding up and checking out of a deal that had just evaporated in front of him. He'd seen it before, I could tell. There was no shock on his face, just the mild resignation of a professional whose morning had been wasted. He gathered his things and said, not unkindly, that there was nothing to discuss, that no lender on earth would write a loan against a property the borrower didn't own, and that he'd see himself out. And he did. And that left the 4 of us, me, Derek, Whitney, and the title officer, in a room that had gone very, very quiet. I have waited a long time to see a particular expression on my son's face, and I saw it in that conference room, and I'll tell you, it did not feel the way I thought it would. Because what I watched happen on Derek's face and on Whitney's was not just the collapse of their scheme. It was the moment they heard, read aloud by a stranger, the 2 names that made it unforgivable. Ella Dunn and Benjamin Dunn, their own children. Whitney's face went white, and then red, and Derek just stared at the table, because it had finally landed on both of them, in a room they couldn't storm out of and control, what they had actually just tried to do. They hadn't tried to take a house from a foolish old man. They had tried to sell their own kid's inheritance to pay their debts, and the foolish old man had quietly made that impossible 6 years ago, out of love for the very children they'd just tried to rob. Derek tried for a second to salvage it. He turned to the title officer and started to say something about how there must be a mistake, that he'd grown up in that house, that his dad had lived there 38 years, that, surely. And she just looked at him, patient and immovable, the way I imagine I've looked at people who told me a part could be machined to a tolerance that physics wouldn't allow. And she said, "Sir, I understand this is a surprise, but there's no mistake. The trust was recorded 6 years ago. It's a matter of public record. Your father cannot sell or borrow against this property, and neither can you. I'm very sorry." And that was the wall. There was no arguing with it, no charming it, no leveraging his way around it, and I watched my son come up against something in that conference room that he could not talk his way past for the first time in a long time, which was simply the truth, written down and made permanent by a man he'd underestimated. Whitney was the first to speak, and it came out ugly because cornered people get ugly. "You knew," she said to me across that table. "You knew this whole time. You sat there and let us." And I looked at her, and I finally spoke, for the first time since I'd said, "Anyone want more potatoes?" 3 weeks before. And I didn't raise my voice because I'd never needed to. I said, "Yes, I knew. I've known for 6 years. I made a promise to my wife, on the day she died, that this house would go to her grandchildren, and that nobody would ever be able to take it from them. I built it so it couldn't be undone. Not by you, not by Derek." I looked at my son. "Not even by me, if I ever got weak enough to try." I folded my hands again. "You didn't take anything from me at that dinner, Derek. You can't. I get to live in that house until I die, and then it goes to Ella and Ben, and there's not one thing in the world either of you can do about it. I just needed to see if you'd try, and you did, so now I know." I got up from that table and I thanked the title officer, who gave me a small nod that told me she understood exactly what she'd just been part of, and I walked out and drove home to my house that I get to live in until my last day. And that was the end of the closing. But it was not the end of the story, because a title officer can void a deed, but she can't fix a family, and I had to figure out what to do with what I'd learned. Let me tell you what happened after, because the part everybody wants is the comeuppance, and I've given you that, but the part that actually matters is harder. For a while, Derek and Whitney were furious. There were angry phone calls, then angry texts, then a stretch of silence. They said I'd humiliated them. They said I'd set a trap. They said a real father would have just told them. And I let them say it, because people who've been caught doing something shameful almost always get angry at the person who caught them first. It's easier than getting angry at themselves. I didn't argue. I'd said my piece in that conference room, and I had nothing to add to it. But here's the thing I had to reckon with, and it's the reason this isn't a simple revenge story with a happy little bow. Ella and Ben, my grandchildren. Because whatever their parents had done, those 2 kids were innocent of all of it, and they loved their grandfather, and they had no idea any of this had happened, and I was not going to let the ugliness between me and their parents cost me my Saturdays with them, or cost them their grandfather. And I was especially not going to let it happen because the entire reason I'd built that trust, the entire reason any of this existed, was them. I hadn't protected that house from Derek and Whitney to win a fight. I'd protected it for Ella and Ben. It would have been a strange kind of victory to protect their inheritance and lose their childhood in the process. So I did something that I think was harder than building the trust and harder than sitting silent at that dinner. I went to my son, not to apologize, I had nothing to apologize for, but to offer a door. I told Derek that I loved him, that I always would, that what he'd done had broken something between us that I couldn't pretend it hadn't. But I also told him that I was not going to war, that I had no interest in punishing him beyond the natural consequence he'd already earned, and that the door to my house, was still open to him and to Whitney, and above all to my grandchildren, if they could find a way to walk through it like family instead of like people casing a place. I told him the Saturdays with the kids were going to continue, because those were the kids to keep, not a chip in a game between grown-ups. It took a long time, months. Whitney, honestly, I'm not sure ever fully came around. There's a hardness there I don't think I can reach, and I've stopped trying. But Derek, slowly, awkwardly, with a shame he could barely look at, started to come back. Not the confident man from the dinner table. Something quieter, and more honest, and more like the boy whose height is on my kitchen door frame. We're not what we were. We may never be. But he brings the kids over on Saturdays now himself, and he stays for coffee. And a couple of times he sat in Eleanor's kitchen and looked at those pencil marks on the door frame and gotten quiet. And I think, in those moments, he understands everything without either of us having to say it. There was a Saturday, a few months into the slow thaw with Derek that I'll hold on to. The kids were in the backyard, and Derek was in the kitchen with me, and he was standing by the doorframe, running his thumb over the pencil marks, his own from 30 years ago and his kids from last year, all of them climbing that same strip of painted wood. And he didn't look at me, he just kept his eyes on those marks, and he said quietly, "I don't know what happened to me, Dad." That was all. Not a full apology. We never really had the big scene, the movie moment where everything gets said. Just that one broken sentence hanging in the kitchen air. And I put my hand on my son's shoulder, in the kitchen where his mother used to stand, and I said, "I know, son, but you're standing in the right place now." And we left it there because sometimes that's as far as two men can get in one afternoon, and it was further than we'd been in years, and it was enough for that day. And the kids. Ella and Ben still come over every Saturday. Ben still helps me in the garage. He's getting good with his hands, that boy, careful, measures twice. Ella still reads to me. They don't know about the trust, or the dinner, or the closing. They're children, and that's a wait for when they're grown, if ever. All they know is that Grandpa's house is Grandpa's house, and that they're always welcome in it, and that someday, though they don't know this yet, it will be theirs. The house with their names climbing the kitchen door frame, the house their grandmother gave her own name to, held safe, across a generation by a promise their grandfather made and a machine he built to make that promise hold. Let me leave you with one thing, and then a question, because I really do read these. Everybody thinks strength is standing up and shouting, making a scene, fighting back loud, and sometimes it is. But I spent 40 years learning that the strongest things are the quiet ones, the part that's engineered right, that's built to hold, that doesn't need to announce itself because it simply works when the load comes. I didn't beat my son at that dinner table by arguing with him. I beat that whole situation 6 years earlier, in a lawyer's office, quietly, out of love for two children who weren't even born when I started planning for them. When the moment finally came, I didn't have to do anything but sit still and let the thing I'd built do its job. The best time to protect what matters isn't when it's under attack. It's long before, when no one thinks you're doing anything at all. So here's my question, and I'd genuinely like to know, is there something precious in your life, a home, a person, a promise, that you could protect now, quietly, before anyone ever reaches for it? Don't wait for the folder to slide across the table. Build the thing that holds. Tell me in the comments what you're going to protect. I read everyone. And if this story meant something to you, do me one small kindness before you go. Leave a comment, even a single word, so I know you stayed with us all the way to the end. And subscribe so the next story finds you when it comes. Because they keep coming. And remember, sometimes the quietest man at the table is the one who thought it all the way through, a long, long time ago.